Good morning, everybody. There was an announcement that was neglected to be made, so I've been asked to tell you there's a family fishing rodeo next Saturday the 19th in LaPorte, Indiana. The theme is Catching God's Three Big Whoppers. No, it's not what you think. We're talking about His love, His grace, and catching His salvation. I believe we have some registration forms out there. If you have any questions, you can ask me or Frank. Well, we all know why we're here today. Certainly to honor the Lord. But there's another event going on throughout the world today, and families come to celebrate this every year, and everybody looks forward to this day. Of course, I'm referring to Archie's birthday. So happy birthday, Archie. What else? Oh, yes. Happy Mother's Day. Right, it's that too. Happy Mother's Day to everybody here. Being a mom is just, it's very, wow. What do you even say unless you are a mom? We don't have to wait until the second Sunday every May to show our appreciation, do we? It's not easy, though. But where else would you get advice like, pick up your dishes, put your clothes in the laundry, life is like a box of chocolates? You see, where else do you get these things? There was a woman who had three very unruly kids, and the whole neighborhood knew how disruptive they were. And someone actually asked Mom, said, look, if you had to do it all over again, would you have kids? And she said, yeah, absolutely. I would just have three different ones. Now, you don't get to choose your children, do you? You don't get to choose your mother until now. Did you know, and this is not a preacher story, I wish I were making this one up. There is something called needamom.com. To the surprise of no one, it is located in New York City. If you need advice for $40 an hour, you can contact a mom. Maybe someone who needs to help you make a difficult life decision, talk to a mom for $40 an hour. Have someone come and cook you a meal, or iron your shirt, or even, get this, accompany you to a doctor's appointment. Isn't that nice? This is real. There's a woman named, what is her name? Nina Keneally, okay? Her business motto, and I'm not making this up, it's this: when you need a mom, just not your mom. It's the mother without the baggage, she says. Empathy and listening to people come naturally to me, and I really enjoy young adults. So as I said this to Michelle last night, and her comment was, what if you're not a young adult? Can you not have a mom then? Anyway, this whole thing is great. It's true, but let's get serious for a minute. Although I am a parent, I am not a mother. And there's just something about that bond that I will never be able to understand. And maybe it's that whole pregnancy thing. I'm sure that has something to do with it. But it's fascinating. And look, I'm not going to name every single person here who's a great mom because we'll run out of time. But Mother's Day, it's a day of great joy to so many. But there's the other side of that. With every other holiday too, it also can bring some pain. And boy, we've had a lot of highs and lows here over the last year. And for instance, I know, Heather, happy first Mother's Day to you, and Sarah as well. Now, I'm not going to rehash all Sarah's story. We all know what's going on. It was very up and down, difficult with the early birth of Elsie, and we're just grateful that she's doing well. And Juana, obviously, you've had a difficult year as well. And I know Carissa suffered a bad loss. And it's just, there's a lot of ups and there's a lot of downs. But through it all, you're a mom, and that is a gift. And again, it's something that I'm not going to begin to try to explain, but I will give you a really good example of a mom who had to deal with a lot of adversity in biblical times. About 3,350 years ago, give or take, Joshua, the great leader Joshua, had died. About 300 years after that, the first king came to Israel. In between those two periods was something, and I know it's hard to see this, called the Judges. Now, if you've ever read Judges, these are not exactly wonderful father figures, are there? Israel serves the Lord. That's a good thing. But then they fall into sin and idolatry. That's not good. They're enslaved. They cry out to the Lord. God sends a deliverer, and everything is great until it's not. So then it's rinse, lather, repeat. So this whole cycle of Judges was very difficult. And the final verse of Judges, Judges 21:25, really spells it out for all of us. It says, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." This was the background to where we're going to talk about Samuel in just a second. This was a critical time in Israel's history. The rising power of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines, if you know, were a real formidable opponent for Israel. They had what would have been considered then to be high-tech weapons and stuff. And they were just a very difficult opponent for the Israelites. So the Israelites, they were devoid of a leader at this point. They needed someone to step up. So here comes Samuel. Samuel is on the left. He's anointing. That's either David or Saul. I'm not 100% sure who that one is. But Samuel would end up being a very important man. He would bridge the gap. He would oversee the transition between the not-so-great judges period and the up-and-down kings period. So he was the final judge. He was a priest. He was a prophet. A strong leader who, much to his chagrin, would eventually anoint a king to succeed him. But did you know, Samuel almost wasn't even born, if not for a very faithful and loving mother. Who was Samuel's mother? Hannah, there you go. So this lesson today is not really about Samuel, it's more about Hannah, whose name, appropriately enough, means grace. Let's talk a little bit about Hannah. What we're going to do, and we're going to go through it quickly, the very first chapter of 1 Samuel. It's 28 verses, so we're going to read a little bit, talk about it, and then repeat. The first part I would describe as desolation. This is verses 1 through 8. Again, it's 1 Samuel 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" We'll stop there. That's an awfully interesting question to ask your wife. Shiloh, again, contextually speaking, Shiloh was about 20 miles or so north of Jerusalem, and it was Israel's religious center for about 400 years. The tabernacle was built there, and the Ark of Covenant, which really signifies God's glory, was there as well. The Ark was symbolic. It had the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Therefore, this is where the high priest, year after year after year, would make atonements for the sins of his people. And we now know that we have a high priest, Jesus Christ, who does this. He did this once and for all for us. Okay, so back to the text. Elkanah, an interesting guy. He had two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah was able to conceive. She had children. But who was loved more? Well, Hannah certainly was loved more by Elkanah. One of the reasons might have been because Peninnah wasn't very nice to her. She provoked her own sister. She teased her, created a rivalry. If you've ever seen the movie Mean Girls, I don't know, it could be something like that. So what's the lesson here? Well, the first lesson of many is polygamy, it's never good. It is not a good thing. Now, the Bible speaks often about it. And how many times can you look at the verses and say, wow, something really good happened because this guy's got multiple wives. No, it will create rivalry no matter what. We see that earlier in Genesis 21:10. We see a mother rivalry. Remember Sarah? Remember Sarah says to Abraham regarding Hagar, get rid of that slave woman and her son, Ishmael. For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. And then earlier than that, Sarah tells Abraham, you are responsible for the wrong that I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. Wow. I don't know why God closed her womb, and we're not going to pretend that we do know. I don't think it had anything to do with Hannah being a bad person or a mean woman. This is not a judgment thing. Look, we all know some people who, unfortunately, they cannot give birth. And barrenness at this particular time was really looked on kind of tough way. According to scholar Ronald Youngblood, he said, barrenness in ancient times was the ultimate tragedy for a married woman, since her husband's hopes and dreams depended on her providing him with a son to perpetuate his name and inherit his estate. Well, Jacob knew this too, remember? Leah was able to conceive before Rachel was, but Jacob loved Rachel more despite this. So then, that's why I'm wondering what is in Elkanah's head as he says, don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? I would imagine her answer would be, no. So that was desolation. What about supplication? As we look at the next few verses, 9 through 13a. And oh, by the way, when I put an A up there, it just means half the verse. Remember, the inspired word, there are no chapters and verses. Just an FYI. Okay. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give me a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Enter Eli. Eli, you could say he was an important figure. He was a priest. He probably never won Jerusalem's Father of the Year contest. We'll get to that later, or you can read it yourself as you go through 1 Samuel. But he was a priest, so he, for better or worse, had to have the respect of the people around him. That 10th verse, I'm using the New International Version, where it says, in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord. King James says she was in bitterness of soul. The New American Standard, if you're looking at them in your chair right now, greatly distressed, she prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. We can, maybe we can relate to this. Even if obviously if you're a guy, you have different situations, but do you know anyone who has tried earnestly and desperately to get pregnant and it just wasn't in the plan? Again, Michelle and I were pretty fortunate. We didn't have any trouble in that regard, but we know people who did or do, and I can't imagine that type of prayer. That's a prayer, that's supplication, that's a prayer of desperation. And Hannah right now is wondering, what do I have to do to get a break here? I mean, everybody at this point, they're eating, they're drinking, they're being merry. It's a great time to be alive for them. Now, Hannah, not her, she goes into the temple, into the worship area, and prays. And she prayed fervently and with deep anguish. The lesson, another lesson, number 2 here is that's the right thing. We all suffer with bitterness sometimes and anguished feelings. And instead of lashing out on our neighbor, or worse, our loved ones, yell to God. He can take it. We can cry out to God. It's okay to pray with bitter tears. Doesn't make you any less of a man, any less of a woman, any less of a Christian. It just makes you a human being who happens to be passionate. And there's nothing wrong with that. She was so contemplative in her prayer, she didn't even realize that Eli was there. This type of prayer, though, it's very desperate. I think of Nehemiah, the very first chapter of Nehemiah, when he gets word of what is going on in his hometown in Jerusalem. And what does he say? Twice, let your ear, God, be attentive to this prayer. Prayers of desperation. I think of September 11th, that tragedy. The first 3 planes went down, and the fourth, as you probably remember, did not reach its intended destination. It went down in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. And by the time all this was going on, the first 3 planes had already crashed, and people on this fourth flight were starting to get wind of what was going on, and they knew that it was not going to end well. And boy, can you imagine? Can you imagine the prayers if you're on that plane, or if you're in any situation where there's no way out? Then what do you say to the Lord? Now, I'm not comparing that situation with not being able to have a child necessarily, but this is what Hannah's life was. This was probably not the first time she made this prayer. But look at that vow in verse 11. You talk about a promise. If you give me a son, I'm going to give him right back. Now, she also mentioned something about using a razor on his head, not shaving his head. That was the Nazirite vow. We saw that with Samson too. Now, it should also be mentioned that Elkanah, the husband, he probably had a say in this too. I imagine he might have said, well, I don't know, maybe I want to have my child. And according to Numbers 30, it was the man's right to abrogate a vow of his wife. So it'll be interesting to see how this might play out. Supplication. So let's talk about Eli's response. It's kind of interesting. This is the explanation that Hannah's going to give him. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Have we recently studied this on a Wednesday night? Something kind of similar, where a bunch of men are filled with the Spirit. And what do the men say? They've had too much wine. Does that ring a bell? Around Pentecost too, at Pentecost too, right? Now, I would say, Hannah, there's a big difference between being filled with the Spirit, capital S, and filled with spirits, lowercase s. That's what Hannah's saying. Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. I know you're the priest. I've got to be respectful. But don't come at me with that. I am not drunk. I am desperate. However, let's not jump too much on Eli, because the fact that he had to think that, what does that tell us about the certain situation right there? This perhaps was a very, very difficult place where people often came to temple drunk or in the wrong spirits. Now, she might have been misunderstood by her husband. She might have been misunderstood by her priest. But are we ever misunderstood by our high priest? Let me tell you about Hebrews 4:14 through 16. Therefore, and whenever you see therefore, you have to find out what is therefore. And in this particular issue is regarding the author of Hebrews telling us that we are accountable to God. So he says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. I love how the author, Samuel, says, she poured out, quoting Hannah, I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Can you think of a time, and I'm sure it's different for all of us, where you just poured out your soul? I mean, I'm thinking of at least a few. I wonder what that's like. And it's different for all of us. But boy, what we can learn again is that whatever inner resentment that she had, she let it go. Because if you're bitter, if you're angry, if you're resentful, that will eat you alive. I think I've mentioned this before. Holding a resentment against someone is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It's the battery acid of our soul. This anger, this resentment, this inability or unwillingness to forgive. It is much better to cry out to the Lord. He knows what you're thinking anyway. That was the explanation. What about the celebration? 17 through 20. Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." Actually, the name Samuel can mean heard of God or name of God, which is really very, very interesting. So Eli's answer, speaking of interesting, okay. He's saying, "You've had enough. I'm going to pray for you a nice priestly prayer." What? Do you think he had any idea that God was working through him at this particular time? I don't know. But you know what? I think Hannah did. She had enough faith to realize that this was all going to be God's plan to begin with. Now, Hannah, and here's what's fascinating to me, she could genuinely worship the Lord in faith. But did she do it before the promise was fulfilled or after? Was it one of those, all right, you gave me a son, now I'm going to worship you? No, look again. Before she gave birth in 18, then she went away, ate something, her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to their home. That happened before. That's true faith. Your faith, our faith, shouldn't have anything to do with results. Because sometimes we need to rely on our faith because our eyes tell us something so different. I want you to pay attention to that word in 19. The Lord remembered her. So what does that mean? Does the Lord have a bad memory? Oh, I forgot. Oh, right, you're Hannah. No. Of course, this is covenantal language. We see it with Noah, Moses, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and the list goes on. But amazing, and there's so much emotion packed in verse 20. In the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son, named him Samuel. I can't do that justice saying it like I just did. I don't think any of us can do that justice reading it. That is a miracle. There's a whole lot of unwritten emotional power in that particular verse. I think of, again, not to embarrass Sarah again, but I think of Sarah and Joe, everybody in your family, with Elsie, and we throw the word miracle around. Oh, it's a miracle, the team won a game. No. You could definitely argue that your child is a miracle. You could also make an argument that every child is a miracle. You think about, I'm not a doctor, but you think about over the course of 9 months, how many things have to go exactly right for you to give birth to and I'll just put it in quotes, healthy boy or girl? Think about that. It's amazing. There's a reason they call it the miracle of life. And please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying if you're only faithful enough, you'll get your way and have a healthy, bouncing baby boy. That's not the way it works, and you know it. And it is an answered prayer. Does that mean being a parent is easy? Oh, boy. That would be the most blasphemous thing I said all day, right, if I said that. But we would never trade it for anything in the world. Hannah knew this. And now, would she follow through on her plan? Verses 21 through 28. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," her husband Elkanah told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After she was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him." Now watch this. "So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And I love how it ends. More worship. "And he worshiped the Lord there." Wow. Wow. We say, we're stewards, and nothing we have is ours, and once you die, it's not coming with you. Yeah, we get all that. But do you really? It's one thing to dedicate. If I say, well, I want my kids I want to raise them as Christians and dedicate their lives to the Lord. She's literally doing this. Here's my child. I weaned him. That could have been 2 or 3 years in ancient times. Here you go. She knew that, boy, God had greater plans for Samuel than she could have ever imagined. She fulfilled that vow. This is a real sacrifice. And we talk about sacrifices, and I know some of us make different sacrifices than others. I get that. And some of us we complain, I got to get up and go to church in the morning and listen to this guy preach. Are you kidding? I got to clean this place. I got to do the laundry. I'm not sacrificing some of my money for this church. That is a real sacrifice. Sacrifice her child. Man, Abraham was about to do the same thing. God did the same thing. Hannah, we don't know a whole lot about Hannah, do we? But boy, what a goal. Her goal was for her boy not to be a great baseball player, not to be a good singer, not to get straight A's in school, but to live in the house of God forever. So here's Elkanah again. Again, we don't know a whole lot about him, but he certainly seems supportive of this decision. It doesn't sound like he knows a whole lot about what's going on, but he says, all right, look, may the Lord enable you to fulfill your vow. See his will and his word practiced among our family. So she brings a bull, and that's very indicative of the gratitude. She could have taken a much smaller animal, right? 3 bulls instead. Wow. So here comes Eli once again. And by the way, you need to understand, as you will find out if you were to read further on, Eli has 2 sons, and the Bible describes them as what? Who knows? As scoundrels. They were scoundrels who had no regard for the Lord. You compare that to the selfless behavior that Eli is now witnessing with Hannah. You talk about being salt and light in a world. Jesus gave that wonderful command at the Sermon on the Mount, which would be 1,000 years after this, approximately. She was ahead of her time. She wasn't the only woman who was unable to conceive that we read about, but she was the only one who went to the Lord in prayer about this. And as I mentioned, the chapter ends with worship. That's the 3rd time we see this family, or Eli in this situation, engaged in worship. Through difficult times, can we still worship God? Hebrews 13, 15, and 16 tells us that through Jesus, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices, God is pleased. There's an epilogue. If we had more time, I would read chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. There's a beautiful prayer that Hannah writes. Now, this is kind of, do you remember Mary's prayer? What was that one called in Luke 1:46-55? The Magnificat. Magnificat, remember that one? This is really the precursor to that. It's very similar. Hannah would use the word anointed. First time ever in the Bible used in connection with a king. It would become a model for Thanksgiving. It celebrates God's humiliation of the rich and powerful and the exaltation of the poor and the lowly. One thing we learned about Hannah is her immense joy is not in spite of her situation. It was because of her situation. And that is that she had assurance that God controlled the world and that his providence was good enough. I titled today's lesson, A Mother's Vision. I was going to call it Bold Enough to Believe. She was bold enough to believe. Last week with David, remember I talked about cause and effect. Because he listened to God and killed the people he needed to kill, well, God gave him gifts. It was land. She didn't realize it at the time, but what would Samuel eventually become? An amazing leader. And this is the whole cause and effect. And this is what our mothers need to see. You know, obviously Samuel was too young at the time, but you want to give your child a gift, and I know it's Mother's Day, but if you want to give your child a gift, pray boldly for them. Isn't it great to know that if you're in trouble, you would be able to say, wow, I'm struggling right now, but I know that my mother is praying really hard for me right now. The third point, one of the most important things we'll say today is what can you, as a 21st century mother, and look, if you're a dad, you can learn. If you're not a parent at all, we can learn things from this too. Learn from Hannah. It's funny, when we had our first child, Eliza, you read all these books, what to expect when expecting, and I don't know, all that stuff, and you go to all these websites. The best advice that we got, and this is true, someone said to me the very first day we took Eliza home, said, all you need to do that first year is keep her alive. We did. We made it. Thank you. But look, we have to be patient while enduring trials. Obviously, Hannah did that. And one of the most important things here is help younger mothers become godly mothers. I know not everybody has all the answers. No one has all the answers, but help other parents become better parents. Let the older people in this congregation help serve the younger ones. Incorporate passion into your prayer life. Incorporate promise, purity, and praise into your parenting routine. One of the things you want to do above all is allow your child to become a servant, to become a leader for God. Now, I have to mention this real briefly. Juana, I don't know if you were at Belinda's funeral, or even if you weren't, there's these cards. What are these cards called? Memory. The memory cards, right. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but Juana wrote an incredibly compelling poem on the back. I don't know if you've seen this or heard it. And I'll tell you what, I am not a crier by nature, but at that particular part of the service that day, with Juana's voice reading this and just the words, it was real close. And you talk about giving God a servant. I think above all, we could say that you did that with Belinda. And again, we've all had similar situations in our life as well with some lost ones. But one of the things Juana wrote, and she knew I was going to say this, so this isn't a surprise to her. She said, "You are taking her back, dear God. I thank you for the time that you allowed a child of yours to become a child of mine. We all will miss her giggle, her innocence, and above all, her love. But we rejoice with her and her angels in her heavenly home above." And then she ends it with, "Thank you, dear Father, for Belinda, your child you shared with me." Now, we don't have time to go through all this, obviously, but you hit it on the head, because at the end of the day, all of our children, they're not really ours. They're God's child. And He allows us to share our children with Him. We all have a yearning like Hannah did. It was hard for her to explain it to people, I would think. But as we land the plane here, there's a reason that Jesus Christ attracted so many people. We are flawed individuals. We fail every day, don't we? But we yearn for something more. We don't always know what it is, do we? You know why? Because it's not a what. It is a who. And that who is exactly where we get our identity, Jesus Christ. Blaise Pascal says it like this. He says, there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man. Man tries unsuccessfully to fill this void with everything that surrounds him, seeking and absent things that help he cannot find in those that are present, but all are incapable of it. This infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite object, God Himself. If you have not yet been baptized, you have a yearning that you don't even realize right now. And there's something that I can talk about every week at the end of every sermon, and it's still not going to give you the power that that yearning would describe. There's some magnetic quality that belies any property known in time or on earth. And that quality, that magnet, is the relationship that you desperately need with Jesus Christ. Because if you're going to be in His presence forever, your sins have to be forgiven. What can we do as a church to help you today? Let's stand and sing.